So, gentlemen, it's great to see everybody. I'm glad we got a decent turnout for two exciting speakers that I've been looking forward to for since Jerry and I talked. God, it was probably back in December. Um, so, just a couple of brief introductions. Uh, Dr. Wooten, he got his PhD in history from Middle Tennessee State University, and he currently sits on the Tennessee Civil War Preservation Association Board of Directors. And Dr. Joe Bailey, he's a historian for the U.S. Army at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. And his PhD he got in 2015 from Kansas State University. And it's a dissertation. His dissertation was focused on the memory of the Franklin and National battlefields, Nashville. And I was telling him earlier that after I read the book one time about Franklin, I couldn't watch any videos or anything of it because it was so devastating. It was depressing. But so he's got a lot of background. Both these guys have a lot of background in history. And Dr. Bailey's book is going to be focused on the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad, which is part of the topic of conversation tonight. And so without further ado, Jerry and Joe, I'd like to turn the presentation over to you all.
Okay, Tom. Well, thank you very much for having me. Mr. Taylor, I remember you, and thank you for remembering me. That was about a good, almost, I guess, a year ago or so, but I certainly remember that presentation. So good to see you again as well. Thank you, Tom, for having me. It's always a pleasure to tell this story, go out there and promote my book a little bit and promote this incredible story of the Civil War that really never really got told because a lot of times it was sort of lost between the battles of Fort Donelson and Shiloh, and it sits right dead smack in the middle of both of those battlefields. So and as Charles just showed there, that is the book. You can pick it up on Amazon. It just it came out hardback first, but just a couple months ago I brought it out in paperback, so now it's $20, and it's a revised edition. It's really, they did a fantastic job. It's a Savas Beatty production, and they do a fantastic job as always. So if you haven't got the book, I guess that's my one and only plug. It's 8 years of my life turned from dissertation into book. So read that. There's a good section, a whole chapter in there devoted on the railroad. So that would be, I would think, a common interest to this group tonight. I also want to thank my good friend and colleague, Dr. Joe Bailey. He's joining us here, and as Tom mentioned, he's working on a separate book just on the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad.
Wow.
Joe and I, both being from Tennessee, we grew up probably 30 miles from each other, but happened to meet at Johnsonville when I served as manager there, and we've been friends ever since. And we kind of went through all the intricacies of our PhD together at that time and shared a lot of stories and information. So I asked him to join in tonight, considering this was a railroad group, and we've got a lot of good information that I hope we'll be able to explore with you all about the really underrated and underknown, much less underknown Civil War railroad called the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad. So as I mentioned earlier to Tom, I usually give this presentation in many different ways. It includes the Battle of Johnsonville, but this is such a broad story. I don't think we have time to cover the whole campaign with what we're going to share tonight. So I'm probably going to take this up to the building of a supply depot that involved the railroad getting the Union Army to that location. And I'm going to welcome, if we share anything that Dr. Bailey or myself shows and that shares with you all in the middle of this, that sparks your interest, certainly, we'll welcome the questions at that point. Sometimes, if you wait an hour later, you forget that important question that you wanted to ask. So I certainly welcome that. So Tom, is there anything else before we jump into the PowerPoint?
No, not at all.
Okay, well, let's get right into it, and let me share the screen here. All right. Is everybody seeing that? I guess
Yes, sir.
nodding. Okay. So there, of course, that's the title of the book, Union Supply Operations on the Tennessee River. Just to kind of put this into perspective, this is a story that comes about first, very early in the war, and then it doesn't really take fruition until mid to late 1863. So the war has progressed pretty rapidly into Tennessee. And for those of you who've read about the war, especially how it progressed south, the Union Army is established and well into Tennessee after the Battle of Shiloh. So from 1862 on, Tennessee is federally occupied from that point, and it'll stay occupied for the remainder of the war until it ends in 1865. So what Johnsonville was today, by the way, today it still is a town in Tennessee. It's called New Johnsonville if you look on a map, but historically it's Johnsonville, named after Andrew Johnson. But what it was eventually was it would be a supply depot, a really large supply depot constructed as I say, a quick fix solution late in the Civil War, beginning in August of '63. It would be the largest supply operation built on the Tennessee River. One of these presentations argued that that was Chattanooga. But if you look at the scope of this and digging into this, Johnsonville was a considerable operation. It had a 600-yard wharf. And most cities, like if you look at Memphis, especially Memphis had a really big wharf. Nashville was a little junior to that. St. Louis was a massive 800-yard wharf. So if you think about that in those terms, Johnsonville had a macadamized stone wharf that was 600 yards long, 6 football fields.
Wow.
So this is a massive front. So very quickly here, just to show you how this happens. This is I guess the namesake of our story here. This is Andrew Johnson. The federal forces, after the fall of Fort Donelson, captured Nashville in late February of 1862. Then Lincoln appoints a staunch Unionist, Andrew Johnson, Democrat, as a military governor of Tennessee. This had been attempted once before in North Carolina. It failed. There was a second attempt this early in the war, that was in 1861, to basically put Andrew Johnson, who had been, again, this loyal politician, in and to serve in Tennessee and as this military governor. Very important is that as a military governor, it came with the rank of a military rank as a brigadier general. So not only, did Johnson have no prior military experience, all of a sudden he's given this rank as a military governor in charge of all the military operations and supplies and organization and defense of the military of the federal state. It's a huge responsibility. So this is where Johnsonville gets its namesake. I'm going to share a lot of photographs through this PowerPoint. What you're looking at here is the terminus of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. Importantly, the knob in the background sits the state capitol that's still there today. It's the ninth oldest state capitol in the Union. Started in 1845 and finished just the year before 1859. Hostilities started to break, and it still is our state house today. Looks a lot different though. If you've been to Nashville lately, lots of skyscrapers everywhere. But what you're looking at there, if you are familiar with Nashville, I don't know, Tom, if my cursor shows up there or not.
Yep, I see it.
Okay. Can everybody else see that? So here's the Capitol. One of the main thoroughfares is Charlotte Avenue, and it comes just like this. This building, this actually is the railroad terminus depot here. This is a machine repair shop that's no longer there, but those railroad tracks are still there today. So what you're looking at is the terminus of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. So that's very important. And I'll get to that in just a minute, but you can see a lot of the Civil War era steam engines here, and you guys are much greater experts on railroad history than I am. You probably know exactly about every one of those steam engines there. But I think that's just such an iconic photograph.
Yes.
So the Federals take Nashville. So why was Johnsonville needed? So in July of that year, federal commanders in Nashville feared that the Cumberland River was going to be too shallow to allow these deep draft vessels to ply the Cumberland River due to a severe drought. So, and these are big transport boats. I know you guys are scattered out all over the country, but if you've ever seen some of these, like we have one here in Nashville called the General Jackson. It's a big 272-ton stern wheeler. You can just picture those, very similar to this.
Oh, nice.
Now I found this in the archives. This is 10 years after the Civil War, of course, but it does show Front Street. And if you've been to Nashville, that is, those buildings that you see off here to the left still exist.
Wow.
What you're looking at is Nashville's wharf 10 years after the war, but this would have been a common scene.
Yep.
I would think during the war, with the wharf just lined with supplies, lined with, barrels of everything. You got pork and beef and, there's cotton bales there. Everything needed to supply an army would have been loaded here and brought into the Cumberland River. But so without the use of the Cumberland River, the federal commanders were starting to worry. They were like, what are we going to do? We have to look at other alternatives. And that alternative was going to be to go 60 miles west from Nashville, 78 miles west, to the Tennessee River. That was a deep channeled river. And, today the Tennessee River, because it's been dredged, on average is about 60 feet deep. At this point, I'm not sure the actual depth that the Cumberland River got to on that summer, but we do know that it was at drought conditions. So, imagine a vessel that's 270, 280 tons. That would be quite challenging for any of those pilots. So that's one of the reasons that they select going from the center of Nashville with this operation 78 miles west to this place that would eventually be called Johnsonville.
Right.
So to resolve this issue, Governor Johnson, and the federal commanders decided to construct an alternate base of supply on the Tennessee River, as I mentioned. Now, in 1861, there's 6 southern railroads that ran north to south through Tennessee. I've got them listed here, and when they were chartered, you had the Mobile in Ohio. You had, there was a few other subsidiary lines, but these were the main ones. You had Memphis in Ohio, which was formerly the Nashville and Memphis Railroad. And if you look at these, they're all chartered. The earliest one being chartered down there, the Memphis and Charleston, which was a east to west railroad from the 1840s, mid 1840s. So see, every one of these railroads are chartered. The last one there is 1854, which is Memphis and Ohio. Those are the 2 West Tennessee railroads that are north and south. The 2 primary Middle Tennessee is the Louisville and Nashville, the L&N, and then the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad that you saw, that I showed you the terminus. Those were the 2 primary Middle Tennessee north-south lines. And then as you went over to East Tennessee, you had 2 really early railroads. You had the East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad, and then the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. And I've got a slide coming up here that shows that. And of course, that one very important, it was of considerable importance to the Confederacy all through the war, which was that, very important Memphis to Charleston line that went through there. And
Jerry, quick question.
Yes.
That slide. You have the Memphis and Ohio. It was formerly Nashville, Memphis. So you're saying during the war, it was actually referred to as the Memphis and Ohio?
That is correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And it was chartered 3 different times. It was originally the Memphis, Clarksville, Paris, and Memphis Railroad. And then it was changed to the Nashville and Memphis Railroad. And then it was rechartered to the Memphis and Ohio Railroad. And Joe, you might chime in here. There was a 4th name to that railroad that I can't remember, but it changed names 4 times. In 1861, it is still the Memphis and Ohio, and it intersected at a town called McKenzie, Tennessee. So, and that's in West Tennessee, which is where our story is located.
Thank you.
And then, so here's the map. So this is a good map. It leaves out some of the smaller ones, but of our importance of our story tonight is this line right here that's highlighted. This would be the Nashville and Northwestern line.
Wow.
It would have a 5-foot, gauge track, like eventually most of the standard track. Prior to that, I think it was, what was it, 4 feet, 8 1/4 inch or something like that. Is that correct?
1/2 inch. Yeah. 4/8. Yep.
And so by the time the Civil War rolls around and they start, repairing and making consistency with the railroads, considering the rolling stock, and especially as the Federals took Tennessee and moved in, they would establish the standard gauge as being a 5-foot gauge. So it was determined. And before I leave the slides, anybody got any questions on this? So this is out of the Railroads of the Confederacy, fantastic book. But this shows you how many railroads under Southern control dominated Tennessee when the Federals moved in. So, and you can see that the majority of those are heavily weighted from middle Nashville west. So that's it circles a good portion of our story. And all these railroads would play a very significant role. Joe, did you want to chime into that?
Sure. I just say good evening to everybody first. Thank you all so much for having me, and thanks so much to Dr. Wooten for inviting me to tag along tonight. It's a real pleasure to be with you. But I think one of the things Jerry did very well was talk about the reasons that the Johnsonville Depot was established on the Tennessee River. And so I just wanted to back up for just a second and bring a little bit more what we might call the strategic and operational context into this, because I think that's really important, not only for what happens at Johnsonville, but for the railroad itself. Jerry did a great job mentioning the low water situation that existed on the Cumberland. Another factor that came into play there was on the Cumberland River between Nashville and Clarksville, that you can see that on the map there. On the Cumberland River, there was a series of shoals there where at the mouth of the Harpeth River, they extended a couple of miles long, and these shoals were a hazard to navigation, to say the least, and they had been for many years. You can see accounts of ships either running aground or sinking on those shoals from the 1830s. So that was another reason that in addition to low water and drought conditions, that the Cumberland River could be really problematic for supply operations. One of the other things I want to back up, though, and mention is Jerry also mentioned the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. One of the reasons the Nashville and Northwestern becomes so critically important, and by extension, the Johnsonville Depot, is the Louisville and Nashville Railroad was one of the other primary supply routes into Nashville. The problem is, and I'm sure all of you know this, that it was well over 300 miles long, though, to Nashville. So it was incredibly vulnerable to attack by Confederate guerrillas and partisans. It occurred frequently, and more than that, it took vast quantities of resources to keep it in operation, and took thousands of soldiers to guard it. They weren't always able to do that effectively. So that becomes a pretty big problem. And so the Nashville and Northwestern, as Jerry mentioned, was a good, solid, quick fix to this, because from Nashville to Tennessee to the Tennessee River, it's 78 miles. And so the net result was it takes fewer resources to operate and defend this railroad. And it's also much easier to defend in terms of the number of soldiers that you need.
Awesome. Well,
thank you.
Thanks, Joe. That's very important.
Can I interrupt 1 second?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, sorry. And specifically, Morgan put that train and burned it in the tunnel. I mean, and so they couldn't use that for a few months. So I know that's in the back of their mind, trying to get another way to supply, Nashville.
No, Mr. Taylor, that's absolutely right. I believe those tunnels were near Gallatin, or just north of Gallatin, right, Tennessee, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
And you're absolutely right. That I should have mentioned that too, that the L&N could be out of operation for days, and in a couple of cases months at a time. So when you're thinking about stockpiling supplies, especially as we get closer to things like the Atlanta campaign, the situation can become pretty dire.
Yes, absolutely. Very, very good point, Charles. Thank you for bringing that in. So just a few other key points. So the Nashville Northwestern Railroad, it's chartered early, just like those other ones that I showed. And it would be like the Charleston-Memphis Railroad. It would be against the grain of those other existing 6. It would also be basically an east to west line. And the General Assembly, the Tennessee General Assembly, needed this railroad, in 1852 for establishing communication between Nashville and the Mississippi River, with the idea that it would terminate in Obion County. However, when the Kentucky Assembly found out about it, they're like, well, wait a minute, we want to connect our line that's in Hickman, Kentucky, down to Union City over to, and eventually connect with this new Nashville line. So, and as I mentioned earlier, they decided at that point that a 5-foot gauge track would be used to more efficiently accommodate cotton bales and agricultural supplies prior to the Civil War. But by 1864, when the Federal Army took it over as a military railroad, they also would connect that same gauge track, using it for rolling stock and military ordnance and very heavy equipment. But anyway, by June of 1861, and so I'll back up just a little bit. So, if you know American history, which most of you have read, and like we do, we're obsessed with it, that in 1857 was the Panic of 1857. It was really, the second greatest depression era of in American history. You had the 1835 panic, but it was not as significant as this 1857. And with that, the stock market was the stocks went down. There was just a major crisis in the country where work was an issue, goods, wages, everything was happening. So there was a good 4 years between 1857 and 64 till 63 till it picked back up, that nothing had happened on the construction of this Nashville and Northwestern line. So when Tennessee entered the Civil War in June of 1861, only 51 miles of that proposed 170 miles, and the 170 miles that I'm referring to, you'll see the cursor if you can everybody see the cursor?
Yep, a red line.
Yeah, if you see right there in the middle, that's the Nashville Northwestern. It would eventually have been bridged the Tennessee River. And keep in mind, there's only one bridge across the Tennessee River, and that's at Danville right here, Danville, Tennessee.
Okay.
It was burned by the Confederates, unfortunately, just before the Battle of Fort Donelson. So there was no bridge across the Tennessee River during the American Civil War. The one that was burned, unfortunately, was not rebuilt until after the war. So the 170 miles would have, when you cross the river, would have gone all the way up here. You see Paducah. Well, Hickman is about halfway in between and near where Mayfield was, where the big tornado came through a few years ago. So that 170 miles would include Nashville to Hickman. So I just want to make sure to give you some reference of where that was located. This is a really interesting photo. Some of you may have seen this. I found this in the archives of the Tennessee State Archives when I was researching my book. Unfortunately, I couldn't include it in the book because they didn't have a digital image that would reproduce. This would have been fantastic to use in that chapter. And it clearly states there, and it was on the plate. I looked at the original plate. It had 1859 Nashville and Northwestern Railroad. And some of you, I don't really know what kind of engine this is. It's very early. Some of you might chime in right here. Joe and I were talking about last night, as far as we know, there could have been a Nashville and Northwestern Railroad in England, and this could be from that. Who knows? But
let me ask a question. I am under the understanding that the Nashville and Northwestern was in two sections that never got linked up. Am I correct on that?
That is correct. So you had prior to the Civil War,
you had the section that was out to the west.
They had built 28 miles of track to the town of Kingston Springs, just outside of Nashville, and it had stopped there. They had also continued about 6 miles from the Tennessee River east to Nashville, near the town of Reynoldsburg, and then the other remaining 24 miles had been constructed basically from Hickman, Kentucky, down to Union City.
Okay.
So that
was the largest stretch, I think, wasn't it?
That's correct. Yes. And that section would not be completed until, after the war.
Right.
I like to add, John, Mr. Ott, do you have any idea on that locomotive?
Yeah, it's built by Rogers. of Patterson, New Jersey. You can tell by the bell frame and the headlight bracket.
Wow.
Was that,
And
go ahead.
about right. This is a late 50s Rogers engine.
Would that be just like a yard engine, John?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, it's a tank engine. It's not meant to go very far. And usually they were used as yard switchers.
It looks like it has a Bury boiler.
Well, it's covered with a tank. The water tank is
No, but I'm looking at the firebox. It looks like it's a domed firebox.
and yeah, it probably has a little dome in the back of the over the firebox. That would be a haystack dome.
Wow.
Yeah, I think it's a haystack firebox.
Inside the cab?
Inside the cab. Yeah.
I can see that. Wow. I guess it got a little warm in there.
See the curve of the if you look through the window on the right.
Yeah, you could see the curve. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
To the front window, to the one to the right. There you go. Yeah, that's the Bury boiler in there, Jerry.
See, Joe and I knew from the beginning. I mean, we're going to be outnumbered with all these great railroad historians, so we're learning from you guys. Hey, I do have a question though. Right in the middle of that, what is this ornate thing in the middle?
The bell.
That's the bell.
That's the bell sitting on top of the sandbox.
Yeah.
And then, so then what is this?
Whistle.
The whistle, it's on top of the steam dome, which in turn is on top of the haystack dome over the firebox.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, you got your cursor on the steam dome, or had it, and then that black box you move down to is the ash pan of the firebox.
Right here. Okay.
No, down below the cab.
Down below the cab.
That's the ash pan right there.
Okay.
So you would burn the wood and the ashes would fall down in there, and you'd clean that out at the end of the run.
You taking notes?
So my, one question I have for this group is, by chance, and you got to think, Western Kentucky is still very rural at that time. So is Western Tennessee. Without an uncompleted track, would there, considering that area only had 24 to 26 miles constructed, and this is 1859, at least that's what the plate said. Would this have been a train that was there, or are we looking at something else that would have been, somewhere that we don't know about in England, or somewhere that may have been a Nashville and Northwestern? I don't know.
No. In
The
England, there was a
style
London
looks
Northwestern,
American.
but it's an American locomotive.
Okay, that's good.
It may have been used in the construction. I mean, a lot of times these lines were undercapitalized, and they had to make do. That is, as someone said earlier, John said, it's a classic yard engine or a switcher. It's not meant for long distance hauling, but if you don't have a lot of money, that's a small engine. You buy what you can get. So that may have been, one of their mainline motive powers. I don't know. I'm just speculating.
In the book, I mean, Jerry perfectly describes the railroad operations there at Johnsonville, that the empty train coming from Nashville would basically, that engine would uncouple, turn around and go back to Nashville, and then it would turn over the responsibilities to the switcher to move things around Johnsonville. And there's a great schematic of this in the book. But
Looks like the water fill tap in front of the sand dome there.
Yeah, that's the filler for the water tank. I'm kind of, if this was built in 1859, I'm assuming it got delivered shortly thereafter, which leads me to believe that it probably served on that 24-mile stretch that was out to the west that never got connected. But that is just based on when it was built and when it was likely to have been delivered. I mean, we don't have any, I assume we don't have any record of where it actually was in service.
There, unfortunately, no. And I'll tell you, this information for Joe and I is just invaluable, because hearing this, I've been taking notes. And there's just really, it does make me wonder, since, describing how the turntable worked at Johnsonville, we've got a lot of information on that. Could this have been a connecting engine, as you mentioned, as one of y'all mentioned, to, because when the trains arrived at Johnsonville, they got onto the turntable. And then we do know that there was a locomotive that stayed there that pulled the cars down to the railroad depot that I'll describe. I'll show you a photograph of here in a minute.
Do we know? I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go right ahead.
I was going to ask, do we know whether the locomotives that were on the section that the Federals built were U.S. military railroad locomotives? I can kind of see them putting locomotives from the north, loading them on a ship in Cincinnati and shipping locomotives down for the section that the Feds built, because there wouldn't have been any locomotives of the Nashville and Northwestern there to begin with, other than that little short section you mentioned, which was what, 4 or 5 miles long?
Yes, yeah. Well, the short section there, would have been in place, by the time the Federals connected the remainder of the 50 miles from Kingston Springs to
they extended, yeah. But you don't need a lot of locomotives for 4 or 5 miles. You might even have gotten by with just push cart and horses if you're only building 4 or 5 miles worth of tracks. So I don't suspect there's a lot of locomotives on the eastern side of the two sections when the Federals arrived. But there again, that's my just kind of putting together how you build a railroad in the 1860s. You had your locomotives where you had your longest stretch of line.
Well, it's certainly it's certainly a great archive to have with this story, because we have no other photograph of an engine other than those that you saw stopped there in Nashville at the terminus, at the Nashville and Chattanooga terminus.
Right.
This is the only
those in the picture of Nashville were all U.S. military railroad locomotives. Yeah. They were all built during the war.
Right.
While the conversation has been going on, I looked up Tom Tabor's Antebellum American Railroads book, and he has an entry on the Nashville Northwestern with the list of locomotives as of early 1861.
Okay. All right.
The railroad had 6 locomotives, according to this list. 2 of them were built in Nashville. The first 2 locomotives, they were standard American 440s, built in 1853. The little pony locomotive you got here, I'm trying to read the number on the sandbox. If you see that little gold medallion on the sandbox, it kind of looks like a 1 to me.
Looks like a 3 to me.
3.
Like okay, great. Yeah, because either engines number 1 and 3 were small 4-wheel switchers built by Rogers.
Wow. Yeah, that
number 3, which is then this engine, was built in August of 1860.
Also delivered right before,
right before the war.
Yeah, and then so it is likely that they would have had engines on the Nashville side, the Nashville segment, we could call it, since there were 2 built. I was unaware that Nashville even built steam locomotives.
It said they were built by the Nashville Manufacturing Company.
Wow, that's
there were a lot of little shops, little iron foundries that built locomotives back then.
Mr. Ott, this is very interesting to me. What is the resource that you're citing there, so I can write it down?
Tom Tabor.
Tom Tabor.
Wait, one at a time, please. I'm sorry. I missed it. I missed that.
The author is Tom Tabor, Thomas Tabor. The book is Antebellum American Railroads.
And I think it's online somewhere now.
Okay, I will.
Yeah, it used to be. I haven't found a copy online for a long time, but
this is very great. This is very important for both mine and Joe's research.
Absolutely.
And,
I'm sorry. I can shed a little bit of light. Of course, I can't talk about specific engines. Somebody asked earlier if any U.S. military railroad engines ended up on the Nashville and Northwestern. The answer to that is absolutely yes.
Yeah.
And matter of fact, I'm in the middle of trying to identify which ones that may have been and where did they come from. And the sources on this are a little bit sketchy, but we do know that the Confederates on the sections that did exist on both sides, just the 25 or 26 miles outside of Nashville and from the Tennessee River, just a short distance it existed, that there was some rolling stock there. And a matter of fact, I think most of you are probably familiar with Mark Hoffman's book, My Brave Mechanics. There is a discussion of some federal officers find out about a railroad. I believe it actually is a locomotive on that western end. And so they mount an expedition to go and get that locomotive and take it back to Nashville.
That would be an interesting story.
I've got a little bit of a factoid. I kind of went down with John was that while y'all talking, looking through a little more records, for this specific engine, the number 3, it was the Rogers build number 954, as John said, delivered in 1860. This might help with y'all's search. It was captured by the Union Army in February 25th of 1862. And returned to the Nashville Northwestern at the end of the war. So but that date might help specify.
Yeah, guys, this is all incredible information. I'd love to explore this, but we still got a lot to explore. So let's if you guys are good, let's move on and chug away, as they might say. So let's pull out of this depot and go to the next slide.
Good.
Okay. Well, let's see. There we go. Okay, so they decide, so the Union Army decides to build their supply depot. And I mentioned the town Reynoldsburg, which was one of Tennessee's very early western towns. It was built right on the Tennessee River in 1812. So they were a witness to the Great New Madrid earthquake in 1812. Lots of great accounts of citizens in the town of Reynoldsburg feeling the shakes that went on for months from that earthquake. But anyway, Humphreys County, which is one of Tennessee's really early Middle Tennessee River counties, established in 1809, had a landing there, a riverboat landing that was quite popular. And just real quick, prior to the railroads, commerce and goods were delivered by the rivers. So all these, you'll see today, like in Tennessee, there's Tennessee State Parks. There's 3 of them named after these landings, like Paris Landing. There's Mousetail Landing. There's Pittsburgh Landing, Lucas Landing. All these landings that were up and down the Tennessee River were established, from 1810 to the 1830s. So you've got a very well-established landing here at Lucas Landing that when the federal authorities arrived there, they loved the location because they could see 2 miles north and they could see 1 mile south. So it was in a very flat, open area of the Tennessee River. And what I'm going to show you, by the way, for those of you who are not familiar with Tennessee, that's the county that we're at. That's Humphreys County. So that's where this story is taking place. Here's Humphreys County. Here's Johnsonville. Nashville is Davidson County right here. So they had to traverse all of this, just to put it into perspective.
Yep.
This came to me by a friend. Unfortunately, it came after the book was published, but this is an unpublished photograph from 1890 of Lucas Landing. This is of course, this is about 25 years after the war, but it's just a fantastic photograph that shows a little bit remaining of the macadamized stone where the Federals had their warehouse, which probably would have set about right here.
Fascinating. It
is really good. And more importantly, before TVA flooded the Tennessee River to form the Kentucky Reservoir, everybody around here knows it as Kentucky Lake, but the official name is the Kentucky Reservoir in 1944, right in the middle of World War II, to bring rural electrification to Tennessee. This stretch of river right here that was about 370 yards wide, 3.5 football fields to the other side, During the war, when the Federal Depot, which is here, was attacked, it would have been attacked from this levee where you see those trees by the Confederates under Nathan Bedford Forrest. But that gives you a really good idea between what I showed you, the photograph in Nashville of that wharf, and then why they're moving to the Tennessee River, to the 60-foot deep wide channel Tennessee River.
Yep.
So in August of '63, Major General Rosecrans authorizes Governor Johnson. In case you're wondering about that, you know, Major General Rosecrans outranked Governor Johnson. Even though, you know, he was the governor, he still had their military rank as a brigadier general. So Rosecrans was in charge. So he superseded Johnson. So he orders Johnson to begin construction of a military railroad to the Tennessee River. So this military railroad, which had been the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad, was turned over to federal authorities, which means a budget is established, and they begin bringing in construction crews to work on this railroad. So the officer that's placed in charge is the commander of the U.S. Military Railroad Department in Tennessee, William Ennis, and he is ordered by Johnson to oversee completion of this railroad. Unfortunately, he gets, following the Battle of Chickamauga, his duties get much broader down on the Nashville and Chattanooga line, and he's eventually replaced. And I think, Joe, you had some things you'd like to share about Ennis for a minute.
Yeah, just a couple to add on to what you've already mentioned, Jerry. Not a blinding flash of the obvious is to say that that Colonel Ennis during the war was an extremely busy man. As Jerry mentioned, he had been appointed by Governor Johnson as his chief engineer for the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad. But at the same time, I think all of this is important to remember because it shows just how many things are occurring at the same time, how many people are involved, and the significance of the people that are involved. So when you do what Jerry and I do, and you're trying to sort out who's doing what and when they're doing it, who's in command, and Jerry was absolutely right. For example, that Rosecrans as the department commander authorized Johnson to do this. But it gets a little bit murky, too, in that Andrew Johnson was military governor. So in that role, he reported directly to the president. So these lines of authority, if you will, are extremely confused. And so if you're thinking this is murky and this is chaotic, don't be concerned. You're understanding this perfectly well.
Yeah.
And so the other thing I would throw in, so while he's the chief engineer, if you will, for the Nashville and Northwestern originally for Governor Johnson, he's also commanding an engineer regiment, First Michigan Engineers and Mechanics. So that's just an incredible responsibility in and of itself. By the way, the First Michigan, they have companies that are in and out of the Nashville and Northwestern. At one time, for a couple of months, they had an entire battalion that is busy constructing that eastern section of the Nashville and Northwestern. But the last thing I want to mention here about Ennis is that military railroads in the Department of the Cumberland at this time are under the military railroads, I should specify, are under the general direction of a guy named John B. Anderson, who had once been an official on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, but he was this general manager of railroads. There were always these political machinations that were taking place and intrigue and things of those nature, for example, Anderson had been accused of having Southern sympathies at various points along the way, and there's so many other things we can get into. But he was relieved, and Ennis took his place as general manager of military railways in this department, and he only held the job for about 10 weeks before he was maneuvered out of it, and John B. Anderson was brought back in as general manager. And so as Jerry goes along with the slides, we'll pick up on that story just a little bit more here later.
We know, does Ennis have a railroad background?
Joe, you want to take that? I'm not sure. I know his replacement, McCallum, certainly did.
McCallum absolutely did. Ennis, I believe he was a pretty well-known engineer. And I have looked into this at some point, but it's been a really long time. I want to say that he did have some railroad experience, but please, nobody quote me on it. It's been so long since I looked at that part.
Okay. So we mentioned the engineers, and eventually, Ennis's duties are required on the Nashville and Chattanooga line. And then at this time, it's February of 64. So at the suggestion of now the commander of the U.S. forces, Ulysses Grant, he suggests his friend from Scotland, who's a Scotland immigrant, and also worked on a lot of the canals up in Ohio, who was brought over to see, and also he was a railroad engineer that had served with the federal armies in Virginia, and was actually a personal friend of Grant. And he brought him to Tennessee, and he and Johnson met, and it was agreed that he would finish up where Ennis's work had stopped. So he helps complete this railroad beginning, coming down there about February of 1864. Anything, Joe, real quick on McCallum?
Yeah, just a couple of little factoids, if you will. So I know all of you are familiar because it's come up already. An organization, U.S. Military Railroads, and of course McCallum earlier in the war had been the nominal head of this organization. But in practice, what he did was handle some of the administrative matters, all of that sort of stuff. And the field operations were actually controlled by Herman Hopt.
Right.
And so at this time, U.S. Military Railroads is operating primarily just in Virginia. But when Hopt was relieved, McCallum really and truly became the head of U.S. Military Railroads. Now, the question becomes, how does this factor into the story that Jerry and I are telling? In the Western Theater, U.S. Grant, now head of the military division of the Mississippi, is not it's an understatement to say that he's not pleased with the railroad situation in general, and he's certainly not pleased with the condition of his railroads. And so in February 1864, Jerry did a great job setting up the background between these two men, but Grant brings McCallum out as an observer to take a look at the railroad operations to see what Anderson's doing. And McCallum does that, and he comes back and writes an absolutely scathing report about what he found. He's actually, while the report is so scathing, he's actually a little bit sheepish about, I'm really sorry I have to say this, but it's my duty to do this. And so the net result is that Anderson is fired. John B. Anderson is fired again. And then McCallum, as not only the head of U.S. Military Railroads, is now made general manager of military railroads in the Western Theater. In turn, he appoints a guy named William Weirman Wright as his chief engineer in the military division of the Mississippi. And so where does this impact the Nashville and Northwestern? Well, Wright, as the chief engineer, appoints a military engineer, Lieutenant Colonel John Clark, as engineer for the Nashville and Northwestern to oversee completing its construction. Not only that, but McCallum brings 2,000 of his U.S. military railroads construction divisions, is what they call them, to Tennessee, and many of those were applied, some 2,000 workers, laborers, railroad officials, if you will, in terms of construction engineers and whatnot. And so many of those come to the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad, and then they are able to complete that in record time. And they also start calling for more mechanics, more engineers, and whatnot from the north that are going to come in and be on the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad during that time.
Wow. All right, thank you, Joe. Thanks. That's a very good insight on McCallum. So as he mentioned, there's various forms of labor to build this thing. And just to recap a little bit, so here's what we've got. Nashville's taken, it's mid-war. The Federals have, they've decided they need to build a supply depot on the Tennessee River. There's a sporadic existence of this Nashville and Northwestern Railroad that's started before the Civil War. So with that 28 miles that went out to Kingston Springs, they know that they had to construct through watery, swampy terrain. And and today, if you're in Tennessee, if you drive on Highway 70, which was the first highway in Tennessee, as you're going west on 70, if you'll look to your right, the CSX Railroad owns that same line today. It's just the bed's been built up over top, but you're following the exact line today as the Federals built the Nashville Northwestern to the Tennessee River. It's amazing. And most of the trestles and the bridges that were built along that route, there were some 17 that's from Nashville to the Tennessee River that had to be constructed over that swampy, watery terrain. So as you know, at this stage in the war, the war has progressed rapidly to the south. Sherman's now operating in Atlanta, in Georgia. So all the mainly, available fighting men, which are mainly white, are down on the front lines. So the available resource that's still in the back lines are black soldiers, teenagers, old men, even women that are serving in a supply role. And you also have to think too that at this stage in the war, they began recruiting regiments of United States colored troops. And if all of you have seen that movie Glory, that came out in the late 80s, it's exactly what's happening right here. These men, even though they were trained as fighters, they're still being used as menial labor in the back areas of the in the back of the war effort. And so these men, together with impressed laborers, and I need to mention that for just a second. Impressment is a naval term that was adopted by the British Navy that, when they docked somewhere and they went into port and they needed crews, they would come on and they would just indoctrinate and basically capture you and impress you onto a ship. Well, impressment is picked up by the U.S. Army in the Civil War. So what's happening is that all these freed black men and women in Middle Tennessee are free. They may have been slaves before. The Federal Army comes in. These men and women welcome the Federal Army. Their freedom is gained. And then all of a sudden, out of their control, they're put back into a form of this impressment, being impressed, signed by an order by Governor Johnson, who promises Secretary of War Stanton that we have the most available form of labor force that there is in Tennessee, which would be these available black men. And so what they did is that they would impress these black workers and some women, a lot of teenagers as well, from local communities around Nashville, including these USCT soldiers, to build this railroad. And this is one photograph that I found in the Tennessee State Library and Archives of one of those impressed laborers. And you can tell, he looks like he's in federal clothing. It looks like a 4-button federal sack coat. But this is a civilian laborer. And the photograph was entitled Civilian Labor, Black Civilian Labor. But I was able to figure out that some 7,300 to 7,500 impressed blacks would provide most of the labor to finish the Nashville Northwestern Railroad from August of 63 to September 64. I still try to wrap my head around it as well as Dr. Bailey does. How in the world, today we have bulldozers and steam shovels that in 1 year to build 50 miles of track again across watery, swampy terrain with 17 trestles and bridges could be done in 1 year by the use of sleds, shovels, pickaxes, and mule and horsepower. And I'll argue, and I'll kind of put that slide at the end. I still think it's one of the greatest military engineering achievements in the entire Civil War is the construction of this line. And what you see right here, it is a common photo, but that's a stage photo like most Civil War photographs were. But what you're looking at are black impressed laborers building. This is actually taken around Fortress Rosecrans in Murfreesboro, Tennessee and right before the Battle of Stones River in 1860, shortly after the Battle of Stones River in 1863. I think it's the summer of 1863 due to the trees. But what you're looking at right here is a 5-foot gauge. You're looking at the timber, and I go into a lot of the timber contracts that were had around Middle Tennessee that were given by the Union Army to local sawmills and local sawmill owners to supply the lumber for building the Nashville and Northwestern line. And with all the trestles and all the bridges that were required to cross those swamps, you can imagine what that took. But this gives you a really good idea of probably what it looked like, what was going on as they were constructing the line.
You mentioned that photo was staged. If you look at the two men in the front left with the pickaxes, having worked on a railroad, that's not what you use pickaxes for.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good
Definitely
point.
staged.
Yeah,
Good point.
very good point. And this, I'm sorry, I incorrectly labeled this. This is supposed to be Trace Creek Bridge, but that's one of the bridges that would be constructed. This was one of the last ones that was along the Nashville and Northwestern line before you got to Johnsonville. Trace Creek is a tributary that flows straight into the Tennessee River. So this creek actually would have to be crossed 4 times before you got to Johnsonville. And this is one of those heavily guarded bridges. This is an engineer officer's drawing that also uncovered out of the archives. I like up here where it shows the Nashville and Northwestern. Let's see, he writes in his notes here, he says 78 miles. What does that say? In possession, in fair condition. And then look at this, he's writing right here, much better condition than before, Nashville and Chattanooga. And then, he's like, excellent condition, the Tennessee and Alabama Railroad.
Wow.
So, I think that's just and this is from a diary from an engineering officer from May of 1865.
That's a great find.
Nice.
And you can see down here, you can see the line, the Memphis and Charleston Railroad line. And he's saying that it's in excellent condition as well. So if he's writing this in 1865, part of the Johnsonville campaign, Nathan Bedford Forrest would tell his commanding officer, Richard Taylor, that, hey, we are in dire need of making repairs to these railroads. So that's going on by the Confederate, engineers and Confederate labor force, slaves mainly, that were preparing some of these other railroads that were still being used somewhat by the Confederacy at this point, but most of them were still in federal control primarily.
Jerry, can I jump in there really fast just on that map?
Yeah.
So one of the things I find this map absolutely fascinating too. And so one of the things I just wanted to highlight really fast is that many contemporary accounts, including newspaper accounts, refer to this country between Johnsonville and Nashville as the Barrens or Barren Country. One of them, as a matter of fact, was a soldier from Iowa. To be quite honest, he didn't think too much of the region. He described the poor quality farms, and he said, I wouldn't pay a nickel for any of it. The other interesting thing is, and I think that it shows it's all a matter of perspective. He describes this region as mountains. Now it is Middle Tennessee and it's hilly to be sure, but mountains. And it's like, okay, well, it's a matter of perspective compared to an Iowa cornfield. That might very well be the case. But one other thing I want to mention very rapidly, in the late 1700s, Middle Tennessee was sort of a geographic center, if you will, for the iron industry. And at that time, the process that they used required vast amounts of timber, because in order to charge the furnace, you needed lots of charcoal. And so they had all kinds of timber and forest that would grow. And of course, when they would cut that timber, it would grow back thicker than it was originally. Now, fast forward a little bit, when they start building the railroad, this becomes critically important. And to be honest, it cuts both ways. On the one hand, before they get the sawmills up and running that Dr. Wooten mentioned, it's a good source of timber first that they can use to a degree on the railroad. But the flip side of that is that later on, all of this dense forest becomes an excellent hiding place, in excellent ambush points for Confederate guerrillas who are operating in the area. Thanks, Jerry.
That's a very good point, and that kind of leads into this. And Tom, I'm cognizant of our time. I know we're at an hour right now, so
All right.
I've got a few more slides to get us through the railroad, and then we'll see about where we go from there. Does that sound like a plan?
Perfect.
So I stuck this in here just to show. So, you know, if you think about a Civil War railroad width, it was 11 feet wide. So you have, if you can think of the 5-foot gauge, and then you have the ballast on the sides where the bed has been built up. You know, you're looking at a boxcar here. If you could look at the 5-foot width of that, probably, and you guys probably know much more than we know about this, but it was still a very narrow track. So this kind of gives you an idea of the railroad that was just carved right out of the woods, and it traversed all of this kind of hilly, swampy terrain. And what you're seeing there are guards on top of the cars, which would have been a very common scene in Middle Tennessee. I go in quite a bit to the guerrilla action that were hitting these trains. And it got so bad from the trains leading from Johnsonville to Nashville that they went on sporadic schedules. You know, very early on, they stayed on schedule. But because of the guerrilla activity that was some of the worst in Tennessee, just in this middle area from Charlotte to Dixon to Clarksville area, Waverly, the trains basically had to be outfitted with guards atop the supply cars. So this would have been an incredibly common scene at Johnsonville as the trains traversed that 78 miles.
You know, as you look at that photo, it looks like there's 2 locomotives on that track. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see 2 funnels.
Yeah, 2 stacks.
What's
Okay.
the location?
I'm glad you guys brought that up. This is somewhere in Virginia.
Yeah, it's on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, I believe.
Okay.
And I did wonder about that second train in the front. I've always wondered about why that's there.
It's not connected. It has a car behind it.
Right.
Yeah, there's a car behind it.
Distance one has a car behind it.
They could be running an extra, or who knows, a pilot who.
A decoy.
Yeah. Possibly. Yeah, that's a good theory.
Yeah, it looks like oh, good. That's all right. Keep going, Jerry.
Okay. So here's kind of what you ended up with. This was Lieutenant Colonel Wharton's map, you know, who was an engineer, who did a lot of map making, a very great map that shows you the finish line. That was so long, I couldn't get Nashville off to the right there, but it does give you a really good idea. As you got closer to the Tennessee River, here's Reynoldsburg that I mentioned earlier. Here's Reynoldsburg Island. Here's Lucas Landing.
Right.
So you can see they had a really good long view, good stretch, especially from the south, of any kind of approach that might be made from water. So as the boats, brought supplies down from Paducah, which is north of us, eventually it would come from Cincinnati, Louisville, down to Paducah, in Cairo, Illinois, and then eventually they'd wind up at Paducah, where they transfer a lot of the supplies into the transport boats, and then they would head their way south. And keep in mind, y'all know, in the south the rivers flow north, so the Tennessee River, they were always chugging against that northern current to get the supplies down to the depot. So with the completion of the Nashville Northwestern, as I mentioned, I argue that in the book that it's one of the greatest accomplishments, I think, of military engineering through the war. So on May the 19th of 1864, Johnson arrives with a party of officers, and they dedicate this place. And after a short dedicatory speech, I go into the book a little bit, but apparently he took one of the stories, he had a bottle of wine that some lady showed up with out of the crowd, and he smashed it over some rails, some stacked rails nearby, and said, "I hereby declare this place Johnsonville." I don't know if that's the story or not. It sounds embellished to me. But ultimately, this is what it ended up looking like. And what you're seeing here's the railroad coming in. And David Meager is a good friend of mine, did this bird's eye view drawing taken from 5 of the original photographs that I'm about to show you. But this basically is a 90-acre supply depot carved out of the heavy woods. They constructed 2 supply warehouses, a double roof warehouse, and a single roof warehouse. Here's the wharf in the front. A number of vessels would be docked on a daily basis. So as the trains came in, they'd pull into this turntable. I was arguing, I wasn't sure when David did this drawing if that was actually a roofed or an open air turntable. I was unable to find any source on whether or not it was, but he draws it as a roofed turntable. So then the trains, you know, the switch train would pull the cars down this way. And as they got here, there was 2 tracks. There was a switch engineer here, and there was a northern spur that went this way and a southern spur that went this way. So that's the scope of Johnsonville. And then you had a civilian town that was built right here in the middle of it to supply, you know, where a lot of the workers, the civilian workers who came to work at the depot lived. And it kind of goes into a little bit more about, you know, the military installations that came later on. And I'll use one, for example, that's near us here, Fort Campbell, Kentucky. You know, you have this federal depot that's carved out the middle of an area deep in the South. Well, most of the Southerners had ancestors that were fighting for the Confederacy, but they were going to work every day inside of this federal depot. So what kind of information you think was being transferred or they were learning going back home that were eventually getting somehow delivered to their loved ones that were serving in the army that they were actually fighting? I thought that was quite a dichotomy that's a lot to try to figure out. But the quartermaster's department runs the supply operations, and I'll kind of go through this quickly. That's the Nashville Taylor supply. But importantly for this group as a railroad group, you're looking now, I showed you the picture in the beginning of the Capitol at the top of the hill. The terminus of the Nashville and Chattanooga line is on the opposite side of the Capitol that you see in the background here.
Oh, wow.
So if you go to Nashville today, if you know where the Country Music Hall of Fame is located, just off of Broadway, that's the exact location of where the Taylor Depot was located. What you're looking at, this is the clothing depot. The Taylor Depot was very broad. There was actually 10 buildings that made up this massive Nashville depot. But the Taylor Supply Depot was just one of those buildings. So you can see the crowns here of the Episcopal Church that's still there today, Grace Episcopal. And just a fantastic photograph. But this basically shows the Nashville and the Louisville and Nashville line as it crossed the Tennessee, the Cumberland River. And just to the right of this photograph is a railroad bridge. And there's a great Civil War photo. I don't have it in this presentation that most of you may have seen. It was actually a turn style bridge. And then the train would cross over, and the first depot that they would come to is this Taylor clothing depot. So that's one of the depot photographs that was in the archival collection that I was able to uncover.
Quick question on that photo.
Yes.
So you can see those bays are kind of high. Is that because wagons would load into there, or would they be just delivering it like straight across on planks into the cars? Any idea?
You know, that's a great question. I looked at that myself.
How about both?
They had to have had planks or some kind of walkway going out to the cars, because, you know, you can see that man standing there. He's a good 10 feet away from the building where the track rail is located.
Right.
So I'm going to guess that they had ramps, you know, that they had wheelbarrows that they would load, you know, using trolleys and such, the supplies onto the rail cars.
Okay.
Jerry, is the Cumberland River off to the right in that photo, or where is it?
The Cumberland River is off to the right. So where you see the rails that are the closest to the bottom of the photograph, if you kept going a distance of about 100 yards, you would cross the Cumberland River. So that's how close this was.
Wow.
So they could supply the Taylor Depot with boats and trains.
Yes, you know, the Taylor Depot, you know, if you really, you know, if you know where the Nashville Symphony Center is located, and right across the street from there is the Country Music Hall of Fame, and there's a hotel there today. You know, you only have to go about 150 yards, and then there's the river. So that bridge was right just to the right of this.
It's an interesting photograph. What archive is it from?
It's from the Tennessee State Library and Archives. And there's a number of them there that they have most of the plates. And by the way, I'll reference a book. It's by James Hubler. It's called Cities Under the Gun. And he has most of these plates, the original plates inside that book. It's a pictorial book. It's a fantastic book. But and Tom, I know we got to move. So
Nah, you're doing all right. You're doing all right.
I just put that in. I put that in as a similar representation of probably what the wharf looked like at Johnsonville. It's taken at Chattanooga.
That's actually Duvall's Bluff, Arkansas.
Is that all? Okay. Thank you. I was curious. I knew it was close to that, but I've always wondered if that was Chattanooga or if that's Ball's Bluff, then thank you. That's something I needed to know.
It is a railroad terminal, I'll point out. So it's very close.
Okay. That's why I love Civil War groups. You know, I learned so much from you guys, and this is just fantastic. All right. So James Donaldson, of course, he was a friend of Montgomery Meigs, who you know was the quartermaster general of the federal armies. So he's placed in charge of the massive Nashville depot in December of 1862. So he is the one ultimately that's over Johnsonville. And so if you've got the quartermaster out in these little surrounding, not little, but most of them were big operations, but you know, you had one in Gallatin, Tennessee, you had some in northern Alabama, but Johnsonville had an assistant quartermaster, and that man's name was Henry Howland. He comes to Johnsonville and replaces Charles Reynolds in July of 1864. He's actually the man in charge that's distributing the supplies. He's basically in charge of the depot operation. So he's a very important man. And you'll notice that in the quartermaster's department, hardly any military officer ever achieved anything above the rank of colonel. You know, Montgomery Meigs, who was a major general, you know, that was a presidential appointment. But most quartermaster's department officers never really achieved anything over the rank of full bird colonel. Now, Donaldson himself would get a promotion to brevet brigadier general in May of 1865. But of course, the war ends after that, and he ends up out in New Mexico somewhere. And just some pictures of what would come through the supply depot, you know, uniforms, you know, canteens, accoutrements, you know, muskets and caps, priming caps, lots and lots of blankets and bedding, linens and things like that. Hardtack galore army crackers and food. You know, food and was a big part of what came into a supply depot. How rationing was a big thing. And that just kind of gives you an idea of an officer at City Point, Virginia. That's a common scene and probably what you would have seen there at Johnsonville. And then this is a wartime map of the railroad coming in right here.
And there was a fort.
Here's the two transfer warehouses. And the place was defended with two redoubts. You had a lower redoubt, and way up here on top of the hill was an upper redoubt. Those still exist today. Here's a cross section of those redoubts.
Cool.
And then Johnsonville's photographer, and we're very lucky because, you know, as you know, Western theater photographs are very rare, but Johnsonville has 5 existing photographs that survived the war. I'm sure that Coonley, when he arrived there, he took more than that, but he was a protege of George Bernard. And if you're familiar with Civil War photographs, George Bernard, you know, was responsible for all those fantastic Nashville and Atlanta photographs.
Yeah.
Coonley was his protege. So he was one of his photographers. And most of these guys were, you know, they were sign painters and oil painters, portrait painters prior to the war. And, you know, daguerreotype photography became the thing. So after the Panic of 1857, they could no longer make a living doing oil portraits and such. So they started making photographs for the military services. So Coonley is hired as one of these daguerreotype photographers. And he actually outfits a rail car on the Nashville and Northwestern line, outfitted by Montgomery Meigs himself, who's actually ordered Coonley to go in this rail car pulled by a separate engine down the Nashville and Northwestern rail line. And all those photos that I showed you of the trestles and I think I showed you one of the bridge, are taken by Coonley. So
Wow.
he goes to Johnsonville, and I'm going to show you what those look like now. This is the first photo that he takes. You can see the rail line right here.
Yeah.
And then the road back there, and you can see a lot of administrative buildings. If you go to the park today, this is what it looks like. So there it is in 1864. And by the way, Coonley took all these plates in November of 1864, just 3 weeks after the battle. And if you go there today, this drive right here is where some of the railroad tracks came into the depot.
Amazing. Wow.
This is one of my favorite photographs. It's the only existing photograph of Johnsonville that shows the civilian town in the background. But you see the central line coming in. You see the northern spur heading off this way.
Oh yeah.
And what's very revealing about this photograph, if you look at these little black dots down here, these are brogans. These are shoes. This just kind of sums up everything. It's late in the war, but you know the military might and this military supply machine was so great at this time. They didn't, you know, think about it. You know, the Confederates went to Gettysburg for want of shoes. Here you got, you know, there's in such abundance, they're falling off the railroad supply tracks and just leaving them there. And if you really, you can really blow this up. If you go onto the Library of Congress, you can see these plates and you can blow them up to like an 8,000 DPI. You can see so much detail up underneath here.
Wow.
But one of the things, and I'll move on. You see the tarps that are draped over. You see all these trees are charred. This shows a lot of the charring from the battle that swept through here because the fires basically swept across the depot during the Battle of Johnsonville.
Wow.
You can also see all the mud.
This is what that area looks like today.
Wow.
And then here's
that's a great shot.
This is another military wartime map, which I put that in here because the photo I'm about to show you shows the double roofed warehouse to the left. So Coonley's third plate that he took is this one. And I go into a lot of detail about the transfer system and pulley system that went underneath this building to bring supplies from the wharf, pulled by basically rail cars, little trolley cars, by a pulley system that was inside this building that went under the building, underneath these tracks where they could load the cars from both sides.
Wow.
And you can see some of the box cars down here.
Yeah.
You can see the elevated tracks here to allow that machinery to come up underneath the building and load the supplies.
Too cool.
And I just love, you know, look at this abundance that I was talking about. You see stacks of wheelbarrows. And if you can really look up underneath that roof, you see stacks of military blankets as well. But you see a lot of the depot guys just hanging out here in overcoats.
Right.
That's kind of what it looks like today. Here's the Tennessee River.
Yeah.
This area has flooded in, but that's where that warehouse was located. This is only about 2 feet of water, 2 to 3 feet at the most. You can wade out there, but wouldn't recommend it. And this just shows the scope of the depot, what it looked like in November of '64. You see the elevated trestle.
Yep.
And this is the southern spur. So Coonley is up here on the railroad bank, and he turns his camera back in the direction. So what you see up here is the lower redoubt. That's that that lower fort that you see in the foreground.
Remarkable.
And then off to the right, you can see a soldier standing in a poncho on top of the wall, probably as a picket.
Yeah.
You can see the gate going into the fort, and then down here you see some of the buildings. I mean, look at put the scale to this. Look at the wagon and the horses.
Yeah.
This building in the middle is sawmill number 1, which I put in the book, which I think is probably the first structure that they built, so they'd have a place to saw up the lumber.
Yeah.
And then you can see a lot of the watery terrain that I was talking about earlier, the swamp terrain. This is a primary picture of what they had to traverse in those 50 miles was terrain just like this.
Yeah.
And of course, I use this as the cover of my dust jacket on my book. This kind of brings in the scope of all of it. You see the rail line in the front. You see the African-American black soldiers here, the 2nd U.S. Light Colored Artillery. And you see there are unlimbered guns here. You see cabins in the back that are housing soldiers. There's a 6-acre horse corral in the back. You see this kind of tree line there. That's where Trace Creek runs into the Tennessee River, which is right here off to the left. You see some extra supply box cars just kind of sitting over here. Just to its right would be warehouse number 1 where it's set, but it was burned to the ground. So again, this is the last of the 5 plates that Coonley took. And that's what it looks like today.
Jerry, would you go back to that previous slide? So the track that's in the center middle ground, that's the spur that runs north?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
And then a fantastic photo taken in 1937 that still shows the depot from the air.
Yeah.
It also shows, these are TVA photographs. They wanted to show the valley before it was flooded. Today, all that is a big lake that comes into about right here. It flooded all of this. But you're looking at the footprint of the federal depot that still existed in 1937. Here's that town.
Right.
Here's the Central Railroad. You know, in 1867, 2 years after the war, the government finally bridged the Tennessee River, and here's that bridge right here.
Yep.
Here's the northern spur. Here's the southern spur. There's the new depot. And in 1935, before Johnsonville basically closed, that shows the depot, and it shows the railroad still there from the Civil War, and what it looks like to be a barracks building or some kind of support building down there that was probably from the Civil War.
Mhm.
If you go there today, you still see all the original spur still in the ground. It still sits there today.
Wow.
There was a federal blockhouse that was there. That's not it. That's actually from Chattanooga era.
Right.
But this does show you the railroad cut that's at Johnsonville today. And as you go through this, the trains came through here. Where the cursor is where the blockhouse was located. Of course, you got to picture this. There would not have been a tree standing anywhere. It was completely clear cut. So as the trains rolled in here, that's just kind of a model of how they probably came onto the turntable. But the trains came through that railroad cut onto the turntable. And we're very fortunate that Johnsonville has one of the only existing Civil War era railroad turntables that's still left.
Amazing.
And what you're looking at there is the center stone that held the pig iron arm that would rotate the engines around. And you can see the stone line base of the turntable.
Oh, wow. Yep.
But what you're looking at in the foreground here is the built-up post-Civil War built-up railroad bed of what would become the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis rail line.
Okay.
As it went to St. Louis, and so it would cross at Johnsonville. But you're looking at to my knowledge, and I researched this heavily, the only known example of a Civil War era exposed railroad turntable that's still available.
Wow.
And Tom, we're at our time. So I think right here, what I'd like to do because this is going to go into a whole nother part, but I'm just going to have to, because we're at our time, I'll have to just kind of reference you to read the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey might say in the book. But I do want to open it up to some questions to both myself and Dr. Bailey on anything that we may have covered tonight. But that does give a pretty good scale of the depot and the railroad. This thing, by the way, is finished September 1st, 1864. So it is an operational railroad from that point. Just very quickly, the Battle of Johnsonville does take place November the 4th, 1864. The place is 40% destroyed. At that point, if you know the history of the war, Hood advances to Franklin.
Yeah.
Eventually, for some absurd reason, decides to attack Nashville. Thomas, who's in charge of Nashville, orders Johnsonville abandoned with all of its stores. So basically for that entire month from the abandonment order from the 15th of November to the 30th of November. And by the way, the last rail car leaves Johnsonville on November 30th as the bloodbath is taking place at Franklin, Tennessee. So all of the supplies that were still at Johnsonville, still under federal control, are moved on these boxcars by rail on the Nashville and Northwestern to the city of Nashville. And in case you're wondering, and you're probably wondering correctly, is that out of all of this effort, out of all the presentation we've done tonight to build this dadgum railroad, it's basically deemed unnecessary use after the fall of after Nashville, after the Hood's army is defeated at Nashville, and is never really a usable line for the federal army after millions of dollars of expense to build this thing.
Right. Wow.
You know,
you could do your stop share so we can see everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
You know, and that's kind of the gist of it. And I know we took a little more time, but those questions, especially about the info that I was able to find out about the engine was just golden. Thank you guys for the contributions. But I do want to open up very quickly for any questions that you might have for myself about any of the information that Dr. Bailey or I shared tonight. So the floor is yours.
Well, one thing I noticed, you had the picture of a bridge over, I forget which creek it was. Looked like the wooden, what was it, a how truss bridge?
That was Trace Creek Bridge.
Trace Creek, right. Charlie and I have seen a video about the Nashville and Decatur, and they had a very similar bridge over one of the creeks there. And the commentator mentioned that it was prefabricated in Chicago and shipped down and put in place. Did you run across anything, any similar activities for the bridging that was done on your line?
Dr. Bailey, I'll reference you on that one.
I do believe that's absolutely the case. So as Dr. Wooten mentioned, the first 28 miles, that's where, coming out of Nashville, that 28 miles is where the railroad existed. That's in an area known as Kingston Springs. And so just to the west of that, the railroad crosses the Nashville and Northwestern crosses the Harpeth River 3 or 4 times through there. And that they brought in some of those bridges right through there. And Jerry also mentioned Jim Hubler's book, Cities Under the Gun. You can see photos of some of those bridges as they existed in that same book.
Cool. I was just thinking that DC and we're doing this series on track plans you can model, for small to medium-sized spaces, and seeing what you guys have uncovered in terms of the research about this line between Nashville and Johnsonville. It's a perfect track plan for a model railroad. I mean, it's got all kinds of cool stuff. It's short enough.
Yeah.
You got the landing. I mean, oh my Lord, it's one of those things where, boy, if I was beginning today, I would seriously consider doing that.
It's like a mini city point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's the city point of the West.
Yeah.
I mean, really, it's just like it.
You're right.
I mean, it is fascinating. Jerry hadn't even gotten into the battle, which he details so beautifully in the book. But, Kingston Springs is very close to Montgomery Bell Tunnel. So the Harpeth River, kind of out of Nashville and whatnot, they've already crossed it maybe 7 times or 9 times in that first 28 miles. And then close to Kingston Springs is this Montgomery Bell Tunnel. This is maybe the first water tunnel built in America. And he built this to supply trip hammers for ironworks. I mean, so as far as a railroad, I mean, you got the river, you got steamboats, you got barges, you got gunboats, you got Montgomery Bell's tunnel. I mean, it's you got impressed folks. That kind of goes against the whole northern thing, you think, but it's really fascinating.
It really is, and Joe, being from that area, I know you're familiar with that tunnel.
Yeah, it's at you can still see it today. It's still there, in great shape. As a kid, I used to walk through it, believe it or not. They don't let you do that anymore, though, probably for very good reason. But it's at It's a satellite state park of Montgomery Bell State Park. It's called Narrows of the Harpeth. So if any of you are ever in that area, you can absolutely walk right up to it and see that very tunnel that Charles is talking about.
So, Dr. Bailey, when's your book coming out?
Oh gosh, I'd like to say about a year from now. I'm being very generous with that. I think I'm experiencing, Tom, what I call catastrophic success. I keep finding stuff every time I think I'm getting close to.
Oh,
I'm tapping all the resources. I find something else, and I'll tell you, the beautiful thing about finding 19th century documents is that you're finding them. The beautiful thing also, or the not so beautiful thing about it, you got to transcribe all the damn stuff.
Yeah.
right. I
Get
get it.
used to handwriting.
God. Okay, good. So we'll check back with you a year from now and see what's going on.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you just for my sake. Thanks to Dr. Wooten for letting me tag along tonight and jump in a little bit here and there, and thanks so much to all of you for having me. It's been a lot of fun, and I'm like Jerry. I learned a lot more from you guys than you learned from me tonight. No doubt about it.
No, this has been fun.
Yeah, well done. Great presentation. Thank both of you for your
Thank
time
you.
putting this together. This was great.
Absolutely. Anybody else have anything? I'll be glad. But Tom, thank you. I know we're over that, but again, I've got here's the book, Johnsonville.
Yeah.
I
it's on
usually
my
have,
list.
I usually have a slide for it, but you can pick up a paperback now for $20, and it's got
Amazon.
it's got some revision stuff in there. As Joe was mentioning, there's things that you eventually just have to write the darn book. But unfortunately, after I published it, I had all these just fantastic primary sources that were coming to me.
Of course.
You're like, damn, that should have been in the book, but eventually you just got to write it, Joe. You just got to get on it. So,
Well,
That's
it's the
right.
same
No,
thing.
That's right, brother.
It's the same thing when you're building a layout. I spent years researching, and after it was built, there was always stuff coming up. And I once in a while I hated these Zoom calls because somebody would tell me something else that I missed, or it was not quite like that. I'm like, okay,
Yep.
but you get to it.
There's
Good.
some kind of law of witchcraft that determines this stuff relative to the timing of when you need it.
Right.
Yeah. Great. All right. Well, thanks again, gentlemen, and all the best to you. This recording will be coming out in a couple of days.
Before
you,
hang out,
Oh, that's right, Dan. Jerry and Joe, if you want to split or stay, that's your call. Daniel's got something to share with us about the website he's working on.
Thanks so much, Vince.
So I won't
Thank you,
take up too
guys.
much of you guys' time, but I actually have a very important thing I'd like to talk to you, basically everybody in society about. Austin can chime in if he feels it. So, as you guys probably know, me and Austin, we're building a website for our society. And so far, it's basically came along tremendously. You can ask Tom or DC, but it's looking good. But me and Austin, we have a huge problem, and it's something that everybody can help us with. We need stuff to put on this website. In case you didn't see, in our groups.io, Tom put out a nice little message about putting articles up. And as Austin has stated there, right now we basically need two big things. One, we need articles. Articles, just like information about like locomotives, railroads, just simple stuff that maybe you send us to like a model railroad magazine, or you put on like a Facebook article, something nice, maybe like a picture or two, but like something that has meat and bones to it. Another one, it revolves around photos. So basically, both me and Austin, we plan to put out photos for like member layouts, right? Some of our most acclaimed members. We need something else for that. We need photos and maybe like a little description about the layout and what's going on in those photos. Simple stuff like that. Basically, the only people we have right now is like one or two things from like Tom, and then like maybe an article from like John Ott that we've posted. But other than that, it's like we need stuff. Just good stuff.
Good. So just email that to you and Austin?
Yeah, if you guys would kindly please just like email to either both me or Austin directly, and I can just put it right up on that website.
Great. Okay.
To
Good.
make some specification to that, guys, you do not absolutely have to worry about, because this is not, again, a transfer to a site. This is still stuff that's going to be in the group site O. If you would like an article represented on the site, that's what we're talking about, and we can definitely condense it to a small blip if you all don't want all the information out there. And we can say, hey, if you would like to read the rest of this article, come and join our groups IO. So they will have to have a pipeline to join our group. Photographs of layouts are great. So we can, because we are having a page where it's dedicated to all of our members' layouts. With articles as well, it contains modeling. If you have the modeling tips on how you built a locomotive, your track, stub switches, and whatnot, we'd like to present those. But again, if you prefer it not to be entirely published on the website, we can put a blip and then put the rest of it in the Groups IO archive if that fits your needs better.
Great.
Right. It don't matter what it is, as long as it's like it
Content.
fits the society.
Yeah, and you're looking for content. I get it. That's cool.
Right.
Good. Thank you, guys. You're doing a great job with that. Okay. Any other announcements or anything?
Chad, you got the stuff that I emailed you?
Yes, I did. I was actually just about to mention that. So I got all that. I'm going to put on a nice little page and all that. I just haven't had the time since right now I'm going through my final week of college. Hopefully, come like next
Oh,
Tuesday,
don't worry about exams.
you'll
You
see
got
some
it.
stuff.
You don't worry about the
Don't listen
exams.
to him.
I'll get to it hopefully by this weekend, I sure.
Buckle
Okay.
down, boy.
Cool. All right, guys. Well, enjoy the rest of your week. Have a great weekend. Good to see you all.
I got a quick question before we go.
Yes, sir.
I haven't heard anything or seen anything about this online, but I'm wondering, the group has had some type of presence at NMRA national conventions in the past. Is anything like that planned for this year?
Well, Roger, you want to say anything about that? You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I'm done now. I think Joel is making some plans to be at Baton Rouge, which is the national convention, if I remember correctly, in June.
Wow.
No,
But I'm not. I really we would need to speak with Joel first.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm gonna be, I'll be up north in Connecticut probably by that time. So I'm not going to Baton Rouge personally.
Yeah, you could send an email to Joel.
the NMRA national convention is in Michigan.
Michigan. All right.
Michigan.
My apologies.
That's still not close to
I'll be up
Connecticut.
June in Baton Rouge.
Right. That's closer to John, though. Yeah. I mean, I would send.
I was just gonna say,
Go ahead, GC.
sorry. I was gonna say, we haven't sent out the request for submissions for a fall meet yet.
Right.
Tom and I have been talking about doing that. We're people who are interested in hosting in their area, come up with the itinerary of events, et cetera, and present to the group. And
I'll put an email out on that requesting that. But I would highly suggest reaching out to Joel because he's our point man for the SIG
yes,
participation in those conventions.
Well, maybe I could just put it out on the list and say, is this going to happen? And Joel will see it. Okay.
Yeah. I'm assuming he reads them.
at this point, we haven't discussed any plans to hold our meet in association with the national meet.
Well, I understand that, but I believe that Joel and maybe Paul Dobbs before him would have a little display in the SIG room or
Yes.
something like that.
Exactly. That's right. Yep. That's exactly what he does. Anything else? Okie dokie.
I just wanted to point out to the hero in the room. Sorry, Tom. Just thank you, Charlie, for getting us in touch with Wooten and Bailey. This was a great, fantastic representation.
Yeah, well done there, Chaz.
Let me just add, you hadn't heard anything until you hear about the Battle of Johnsonville.
Wow.
I mean, the detail that he goes into research this thing, it'll bend your mind. You know, I mean, he's really fabulous on the second half of the book.
Well, you know what I'll do is I'll make sure that we get him scheduled later on in the year then.
I really would. I really would.
Yep.
He's got so much to say.
Cool.
He could have gone on for another half hour.
Oh, no, an
Please.
hour, an hour.
Well, I mean, you know, if we had extended it.
Yeah, yeah. He's got a lot of information about that.
And everybody who contributed to the discussion, thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to you guys' expertise.
Yeah, I think y'all knocked their socks off. I mean, on the engines and whatnot. That was really cool.
Yeah, John and Austin coming up with that stuff. That's great. I love that. They were really appreciative. I saw Jerry there making copious notes of things you guys were saying. Good. All right. Is it safe to say goodbye now? All right. Ciao, gentlemen.
Thanks, guys.
Right.
Hey, Dan, you got a minute?
Which Dan?
Yeah, which one?
Free.
Yeah.
And Chad, because you'll be in here anyway.